The ledger sat open on the plantation desk, its pages yellowed with age and humidity. But it wasn't the accounts of cotton yields or tobacco sales that made the overseer's hand tremble as he held his lantern closer. It was the column he'd been instructed to keep separate, hidden from casual eyes. A column that tracked something no one wanted to speak about, yet everyone had begun to notice. The entries stretched back 7 years now, each one more troubling than the last. Blue eyes, blonde hair, fair skin that darkened only slightly as the children grew. All born to enslaved women across 3 parishes in Louisiana. All different mothers, all bearing children who looked nothing like their mothers, nothing like their recorded fathers, nothing like anyone else in the quarters. And the whispers had started. Whispers that traveled from plantation to plantation along the Mississippi River, carried by traders and runaways, by house servants who overheard their masters' worried conversations, by midwives who had delivered these strange babies and felt their blood run cold. Because someone was fathering these children. Someone who moved unseen. Someone who left no trace except the evidence written in the faces of infants who should not exist. Before we continue with the story of Louisiana's most disturbing secret, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And I want to hear from you. Leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. Now let's uncover what really happened in those Louisiana parishes between 1837 and 1844. The mystery would consume 7 years, destroy families, end lives, and reveal a truth so calculated and cruel that even hardened plantation owners would struggle to comprehend it. But in 1837, when the first of these children was born, no one yet understood what they were witnessing. What began as a single anomaly would become a pattern so disturbing that it would shake the foundations of Louisiana's plantation society, expose the darkest corners of a system built on human bondage, and reveal how power could be wielded with absolute impunity when the law itself was designed to protect the perpetrator. Louisiana in the late 1830s was a place of contradictions and extremes. New Orleans thrived as one of America's wealthiest cities, its port bringing in sugar, cotton, and enslaved people by the thousands. The French and Spanish colonial influences still shaped the culture, the architecture, the very language spoken in the streets. Creole French mixed with English, Spanish, and African languages to create a linguistic tapestry unique to the region. The city's theaters hosted opera and ballet. Its restaurants served cuisine that rivaled Paris. Its ballrooms glittered with chandeliers imported from Europe. But beyond the city's gaslights and grand homes, beyond the carefully manicured gardens and the elegant facades, the plantation economy ruled with absolute authority. The parishes north of New Orleans, St. James, St. John the Baptist, and Ascension formed the heart of sugar country. These were not the sprawling cotton plantations of Mississippi or Alabama, where enslaved people worked in relative isolation across vast acreages. Sugar cultivation required different labor, different timing, different brutality. The sugarcane had to be harvested and processed within a narrow window before the first frost could damage the crop. This meant that from October through December, the grinding season, every plantation became a factory running 24 hours a day. Enslaved people worked in shifts that stretched 18, 20, sometimes 22 hours. They cut cane in the fields under the November sun, hauled it to the sugar houses, fed it into the grinding mills, boiled the juice in massive kettles, stirred the crystallizing sugar, packed it into hogsheads for shipping. The machinery was dangerous. The mills could catch clothing, hair, limbs, pulling workers into the grinding rollers before anyone could react. The kettles of boiling sugar juice could splash, causing burns that went down to the bone. The exhaustion led to accidents, to mistakes, to deaths that were recorded in ledgers as simple losses of property, calculated against the profit margin of the harvest. The mortality rate among enslaved people on Louisiana sugar plantations was the highest in the American South. Owners knew this. They calculated it into their business models. It was cheaper to work people to death and buy replacements than to maintain a sustainable pace of labor. This was the world into which those strange children would be born. A world where human beings were reduced to units of production, where their bodies were not their own, where the law offered them no protection and no recourse. The parishes were densely populated compared to other plantation regions. Properties sat close together along the river, their boundaries often separated by nothing more than a line of cypress trees or a narrow bayou. The river was the highway, the lifeline, the connection between plantations. Steamboats moved up and down constantly, carrying goods, mail, passengers, news. Information traveled quickly here. A birth on one plantation would be known on 3 others by the next morning. A death, a sale, a punishment, all became common knowledge almost immediately. This interconnectedness made the mystery all the more disturbing, because when the unusual births began, they didn't happen in isolation. They formed a pattern, and patterns meant intention. The first plantation to record such a birth was Bellemont, a mid-sized sugar operation owned by the Duchamp family. They'd held the land for 3 generations, since the Spanish colonial period. The main house was built in the Creole style, raised on brick pillars to protect against flooding, with wide galleries wrapping around both floors. Moss-draped oak trees lined the drive from the river road. Behind the main house, the sugar works sprawled, the mill building, the boiling house, the curing sheds, the cooperage where barrels were made. Further back, beyond a screen of trees, sat the quarters, 2 rows of cabins facing each other across a dirt path. Each cabin housed multiple families, sometimes as many as 10 or 12 people in a single room. There was no privacy, no space, no comfort, just survival. The Duchamp family consisted of Monsieur Philippe Duchamp, his wife Celeste, and their 3 children. Philippe was 48 years old in 1837, a thin, nervous man who had inherited the plantation from his father and managed it with constant anxiety. He worried about crop yields, about sugar prices, about competition from Cuban imports, about the loans he'd taken to expand his operations. He worried about slave rebellions, about abolitionists, about the changing political climate that threatened the entire system his wealth depended on. His overseer, Vincent Hebert, was 32 years old and had worked at Belmont for 6 years. Hebert was unusual among overseers. He could read and write fluently in both French and English. He kept meticulous records. He had a reputation for being firm but not unnecessarily cruel, for maximizing productivity through organization rather than through terror. This made him valuable to Duchamp, who lacked the stomach for the violence that many plantation owners considered necessary. Hebert lived in a small house between the main residence and the quarters, positioned so he could monitor both. He rose before dawn every day, made his rounds, assigned work details, tracked progress, recorded everything in his ledgers. He knew every enslaved person on the plantation by name, knew their skills, their weaknesses, their family connections. This knowledge was power, and Hebert wielded it carefully. It was Hebert who first noticed the anomaly in March of 1837, and it was Hebert who would spend the next 7 years trying to understand what it meant. The child was born just before dawn on March 14, 1837, delivered by an elderly enslaved midwife named Josephine, who had brought more than 200 babies into the world over her 60-some years. Josephine had been born in Saint-Domingue before the Revolution, before it became Haiti. She'd been brought to Louisiana as a young woman and had survived everything. The transition from French to American rule, multiple changes of ownership, the deaths of her own children, the endless grinding labor of the sugar harvest. She'd seen every complication, every variation, every tragedy that childbirth could bring. Breech births, stillbirths, mothers who bled out on the cabin floor, babies born too early to survive, twins tangled together, infections that turned to fever and death. She'd learned to keep her face neutral, to show no emotion, to simply do the work and move on to the next crisis. But when she cleaned the newborn girl and saw her features in the lamplight, she felt something she rarely experienced: genuine fear. The mother was a woman named Marie, dark-skinned, strong, 23 years old. She'd been born on Bellemont, had known no other life. Her mother had died in the sugar house when Marie was 12, caught by the grinding mill, her screams cut short as the machinery pulled her in. Marie had watched it happen. She'd been standing 10 feet away, unable to move, unable to help, unable to do anything but witness. After that, Marie had become quiet. She spoke only when necessary, kept her eyes down, did her work without complaint. She'd been paired with a man named Thomas when she was 18, a pairing arranged by Hebert to produce children who would become plantation property. Thomas was a field hand, strong and reliable, 25 years old. They lived together in one corner of a cabin they shared with 3 other families. Marie had given birth to 1 child already, a boy named Jacques, who was now 4 years old. He looked like his parents, dark skin, dark eyes, tightly coiled hair. He was healthy, bright, already being trained to work in the fields. This second child should have looked the same. Every expectation, every understanding of heredity, every observation of how children resembled their parents suggested that this baby would have dark skin, dark eyes, dark hair. Instead, when Josephine wiped away the birth fluids and held the infant up to the lamp, she saw pale skin, hair so blonde it was almost white, and eyes the color of a clear winter sky. Josephine wrapped the child quickly, her mind racing. She'd heard stories, of course, passed down from older midwives, stories that went back generations. Stories of children born looking different from their parents, explained away by distant ancestry, by bloodlines that carried hidden traits. The old women spoke of how African peoples had mixed with Arab traders, with Portuguese sailors, with the various peoples who had moved across the continent over centuries. Sometimes those distant mixtures would resurface, they said, producing a child with lighter skin or different features. But this was different. This wasn't a slightly lighter complexion or looser curl pattern. This child looked as though she'd been born to a Swedish immigrant, not to Marie. The features were completely European. The narrow nose, the thin lips, the bone structure of the face. When Marie saw her daughter, she didn't speak. She simply stared, her exhaustion replaced by something else. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. Her hands shook as she took the baby, and Josephine saw tears begin to slide down her face. "Does she look like anyone you know?" Josephine asked quietly, a question that carried more weight than its simple words suggested. Marie's silence was answer enough. She held her daughter close, rocking slightly, and Josephine saw in her face a grief so profound it seemed to fill the small cabin. Thomas arrived an hour later, coming from the fields where he'd been working the night shift during grinding season. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the child, his face going blank with shock. "That's not mine," he said flatly. "She is yours," Marie whispered. "She is. Look at her. Look at her and tell me that's my child." "Thomas, please." "Who was it?" His voice was rising now, dangerous. "Who did you—" "No one," Marie said, her voice breaking. "I swear to you, no one. I don't understand this. I don't understand." Josephine intervened, stepping between them. "This happens sometimes," she said, though she didn't believe it herself. "Old blood coming through. Ancestors from long ago." Thomas stared at the baby, at Marie, at Josephine. Then he turned and walked out of the cabin without another word. By midday, everyone on Bellemont knew about the birth. The news spread through the quarters like wildfire. People came to see for themselves, crowding into the cabin, staring at the impossible child. Some whispered about curses, about spirits, about punishments from God. Others were silent, their faces troubled, as though they understood something they couldn't or wouldn't speak aloud. By evening, the news had reached 2 neighboring plantations, carried by enslaved people who had relatives on other properties, by traders who stopped at multiple landings along the river, by the invisible network of communication that existed beneath the surface of plantation society. By the end of the week, Vincent Hébert had been called to the main house to explain the situation to Monsieur Duchamp. Hébert walked up the oak-lined drive with a sense of dread. He'd already questioned Marie, gently at first, then with increasing pressure. She'd insisted she'd been with no one but Thomas. She'd sworn it, even as tears streamed down her face, even as she held her strange-looking daughter. He'd questioned Thomas, who'd refused to accept the child as his own, who'd moved out of the cabin and requested reassignment to a different work crew. He'd questioned other enslaved people who lived in the same cabin, who might have seen or heard something. No one had any information. Or if they did, they weren't sharing it. Duchamp was pacing his study when Hébert arrived, his thin face pinched with worry. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old books. A portrait of Duchamp's father hung over the fireplace, stern and judgmental. "Sit down, Hébert. Tell me what happened." Hébert sat in the chair across from Duchamp's desk and laid out the facts as he knew them. The birth, the child's appearance, Marie's insistence that she'd been with no one but Thomas, the lack of any evidence or testimony to suggest otherwise. "It's not possible," Duchamp said, resuming his pacing. "Thomas is the father. It's in the records. I have the breeding records right here." He pulled out a ledger, flipped through pages. Marie and Thomas paired in 1832. First child born 1833. This is the second. Thomas is the father. "Yes, sir," Hebert replied carefully. "That's what the records show, but the child—" "I don't care what the child looks like," Duchamp interrupted, his voice sharp with anxiety. "There's an explanation. There must be. Mixed ancestry, perhaps. Some distant relative. These things happen. Sir, I've seen mixed ancestry. This is different. This child looks completely European." Duchamp stopped pacing and stared at Hébert. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, sir. I'm simply reporting what I've observed. Because if you're suggesting that someone, that one of us—" Duchamp couldn't finish the sentence. The implication was too dangerous, too scandalous. "I'm not suggesting anything," Hebert repeated. "I'm asking what you want me to do." Duchamp sat down heavily in his chair. He looked suddenly older, more tired. "Record the birth. Note the unusual appearance. But the father of record remains Thomas. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." "And Hébert, I don't want this discussed. Not with the other overseers, not with anyone. It's a private matter, an anomaly, nothing more." "Yes, sir." Hébert left the main house with a troubled mind. He understood Duchamp's position. Any suggestion that a white man had fathered a child with an enslaved woman would be scandalous, but it wouldn't be shocking. Such things happened, though they were rarely acknowledged openly. The real problem was the implication of force, of violation. Because Marie insisted she'd been with no one but Thomas. Which meant, if the child wasn't Thomas's, then something had happened to Marie without her consent. And if that was true, if someone had violated an enslaved woman on Duchamp's property, it raised questions about security, about control, about the order that was supposed to govern plantation life. It suggested that someone had access to the quarters, to the women, without oversight or consequence. Hebert went back to his house and opened his personal journal, separate from the official plantation records. He wrote down everything he knew about the birth, about Marie's testimony, about the child's appearance. He dated the entry carefully, March 14th, 1837. He had no way of knowing that this entry would be the first of many, that he was documenting the beginning of something that would consume the next 7 years of his life. The child was named Claire. Marie tried to care for her, tried to love her, but the baby was a constant reminder of something Marie couldn't explain and couldn't escape. Thomas never acknowledged Claire as his daughter. He avoided Marie, avoided the cabin where she lived, avoided even looking at the child when their paths crossed. The other enslaved people on Belmont were divided in their reactions. Some felt sympathy for Marie, understanding that something terrible had happened to her, even if she couldn't or wouldn't speak of it. Others were suspicious, believing she must have been with someone, must have done something to bring this situation on herself. A few were frightened, sensing that Claire's existence meant something dangerous, something that threatened them all. Claire grew. She was a healthy baby, meeting all the normal milestones, but her appearance became more striking as she aged. Her hair grew in thick and blonde. Her eyes remained that startling blue. Her skin stayed pale, burning easily in the Louisiana sun. By the time she was 6 months old, she looked like a Nordic child who had somehow ended up in the quarters of a Louisiana plantation. The contrast between her appearance and her surroundings was jarring, disturbing, impossible to ignore. And then, 14 months after Claire's birth, it happened again. The second birth occurred on a plantation called Riverside, 6 miles upriver from Bellemont. Riverside was larger than Bellemont, with more acreage under cultivation and a larger enslaved population. The owner was a man named Etienne Broussard, 55 years old, a second-generation Louisiana planter whose family had made their fortune in the sugar trade. Broussard was known for running a profitable operation. He was also known for his temper, for his willingness to use violence to maintain control, for his belief that enslaved people needed to be kept in a state of fear to remain productive. His overseer, a man named Gideon Frost, shared this philosophy. Frost was 40 years old, a transplant from Virginia who had come to Louisiana seeking opportunity. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. He carried a whip coiled at his belt and wasn't afraid to use it. The enslaved people at Riverside feared him, and Frost believed that fear was the foundation of good management. The mother was a woman named Delphine, 20 years old, who worked in the main house as a laundress. She'd been selected for this position because of her quiet demeanor, her efficiency, her ability to remain invisible. House servants had to master this skill. The ability to be present, but not noticed, to move through rooms without drawing attention, to hear conversations without appearing to listen. Delphine had been born on a plantation in the Natchez district and sold to Riverside when she was 15. The sale had separated her from her mother and 2 younger siblings. She'd never seen them again. This loss had hollowed her out, left her with a kind of emptiness that she filled with work, with routine, with the small comforts she could find. A moment of rest, a full meal, the absence of pain. She'd been paired with a field hand named Samuel, 22 years old, strong and quiet. They lived together in the quarters, shared a space in one of the cabins. Their relationship was cordial but not close. They were 2 people thrown together by someone else's decision, making the best of circumstances neither had chosen. When Delphine discovered she was pregnant, she felt a mix of emotions. Fear, because pregnancy meant vulnerability, meant pain, meant the possibility of death, but also a small, fragile hope. A child would be someone to love, someone who belonged to her, at least for a little while before the plantation claimed that child too. The pregnancy progressed normally. Delphine continued her work in the laundry, hauling water, scrubbing clothes, hanging them to dry in the humid air. As her belly grew, the work became harder, but she didn't complain. Complaining led to punishment. She gave birth in May of 1838, attended by the plantation midwife, a woman named Ruth. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. But finally the baby was born. A boy, healthy, crying lustily. Ruth cleaned the infant and then stopped, her hands frozen, her face going pale. "What is it?" Delphine asked, exhausted, reaching for her son. "What's wrong?" Ruth didn't answer. She simply handed the baby to Delphine and stepped back, her expression troubled. Delphine looked down at her son and felt the world tilt. The baby had blonde hair, blue eyes, and skin so pale it seemed translucent. He looked nothing like her, nothing like Samuel, nothing like anyone in her family. "No," she whispered. "No, this can't. Who's the father?" Ruth asked quietly. "Samuel. Samuel is the father. I haven't been with anyone else, I swear it." "Then how do you explain this child?" "I can't," Delphine said, tears beginning to fall. "I can't explain it." Samuel was brought from the fields to see his son. His reaction was immediate and angry. He stared at the baby, at Delphine, and his face hardened. "You've been with someone," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I haven't. Samuel, I swear, don't lie to me. Look at him. That's not my child." "He is. He has to be. I haven't been with anyone else." "Then who? Who did this?" "I don't know," Delphine sobbed. "I don't know." Samuel left the cabin and didn't return. He requested a transfer to a different work crew, to a different cabin. He never acknowledged the boy as his son. Gideon Frost heard about the birth within hours. He came to the quarters, pushed into the cabin where Delphine lay recovering, and stared at the baby with a mixture of shock and anger. "Who's the father?" he demanded. "Samuel," Delphine whispered. "That's not Samuel's child. Look at it. I haven't been with anyone else." "You're lying." "I'm not. I swear on my life I'm not lying." Frost questioned her for an hour, his voice growing harsher, his threats more explicit. But Delphine's story never changed. She'd been with no one but Samuel. She couldn't explain the child's appearance. She didn't understand what had happened. Finally, Frost gave up. He reported the situation to Broussard, who reacted with fury. He accused Frost of not maintaining proper control, of allowing enslaved people to move freely, of failing in his duties. Frost defended himself, insisting that he ran a tight operation, that there was no way an outsider could have accessed the quarters without being noticed. The argument went in circles. Finally, Broussard ordered the birth recorded with Samuel as the father of record, despite the obvious impossibility. The matter was to be closed, not discussed, forgotten. The baby was named Jean, and like Claire before him, he was a living impossibility, a child who shouldn't exist. When news of Jean's birth reached Belmont, Vincent Heber felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't random genetic variation. This was something else, something deliberate, something that was happening across multiple plantations. He pulled out his personal journal and made a new entry, carefully noting the date of Jean's birth, the plantation where it occurred, the mother's name, the circumstances. He placed this entry next to his notes about Claire's birth and stared at the two entries, looking for connections. Both mothers had been working in or near the main houses of their respective plantations. Marie had been called up from the fields to help with cleaning during a period when Bellamont's regular house staff was short-handed. Delphine already worked in the house, but she'd been assigned to additional duties in the months before her pregnancy, including night work, cleaning and preparing rooms after the family had retired. Heber felt his pulse quicken. This was a pattern, a connection. It might mean nothing, or it might mean everything. He began making inquiries, carefully, quietly. He spoke to traders who moved between plantations, asking casual questions about births, about unusual occurrences, about gossip they might have heard. He questioned enslaved people who had relatives on other properties, listening to their conversations, noting details. And he waited. Because if his suspicions were correct, if this was a pattern rather than a coincidence, then it would happen again. He was right. Over the next 2 years, 3 more children were born with the same impossible features. Each birth followed the same pattern. An enslaved mother with dark features, a recorded father who matched her appearance, and a child who looked nothing like either parent. The third child was born at a plantation called Oakmont in November of 1838. The mother was a woman named Isabel, 25 years old, who worked in the main house as a cook's assistant. The baby was a girl with blonde hair and blue eyes. Isabel insisted she'd been with no one but her partner, a man named Gabriel. No one believed her, but no one could prove otherwise. The fourth child was born at a plantation called St. Clair in March of 1839. The mother was a woman named Thérèse, 19 years old, who had been brought up from the quarters to help serve at a dinner party 2 months before her pregnancy began. The baby was a boy with the same distinctive features. Thérèse's partner, a man named Antoine, refused to acknowledge the child. The fifth child was born at a plantation called Magnolia Grove in September of 1839. The mother was a woman named Pauline, 22 years old, who worked in the laundry. She'd been called to the main house to help with cleaning during a period when the regular staff was occupied with other duties. Her baby was a girl, blonde and blue-eyed. Her partner, a man named Louis, left her after the birth. Vincent Heber documented each birth in his private journal. He noted the dates, the plantations, the mothers' names, their work assignments. He created a map, marking each location where a birth had occurred. The plantations were spread across 3 parishes, but all were within a 15-mile radius along the Mississippi River. He also noted something else, something that had taken him months to piece together. A name that appeared in the background of each situation, never prominently, never obviously, but always there. Dr. Marcus Levine. Levine was a physician, 42 years old, unmarried, respected throughout the parishes. He'd been born in Louisiana to a French father and a Creole mother. He'd been sent to Paris to study medicine at the age of 18, had spent 8 years there, and had returned to Louisiana in 1825 to establish his practice. He was known for his skill, particularly in treating fevers and infections that were common in the humid Louisiana climate. He was also known for his discretion, his willingness to treat delicate matters without gossip, his ability to keep secrets. This made him popular among the planter families, who valued privacy above almost everything else. Levine served several plantations as their primary doctor, traveling between them as needed. He treated the planter families for their various ailments, and he also treated enslaved people when their value as property justified the expense. A skilled worker with a broken bone, a pregnant woman whose child represented future property, a house servant whose training made them valuable. These were worth the cost of medical care. Levine was also known for his distinctive appearance. He was tall and thin, with pale blonde hair that he wore longer than was fashionable, and striking blue eyes that seemed to see through people. He dressed well, but not ostentatiously, in dark suits that emphasized his pale coloring. He moved with a kind of deliberate grace, speaking softly, never raising his voice, always maintaining perfect control. Heber had met Levine several times over the years. The doctor had been called to Belmont to treat Madame Duchamp for a fever, to set a broken arm for a field hand who'd been injured during harvest, to attend to various minor ailments. Heber had found him professional, competent, and oddly cold. The story, but it was too late. Too many people knew. The scandal was becoming public knowledge. And finally, inevitably, the story reached Dr. Marcus Levine himself. Levine's response was not what anyone expected. He didn't deny the accusations. He didn't flee. He didn't show any sign of shame or fear. Instead, he called a meeting. In September 1842, he sent formal invitations to the owners of all the affected plantations, asking them to gather at his home on a Thursday evening. He also invited Judge Thibault, several other prominent citizens, and, surprisingly, Vincent Heber. The invitations were polite but firm. Levine wrote that he understood there had been questions about certain matters, and he wished to address these questions directly and comprehensively. He requested the courtesy of a hearing before any further action was taken. The plantation owners were caught off guard. The invitation itself was unusual, almost unprecedented, but they agreed to attend, curious about what Levine might say, how he might defend himself. Heber received his invitation with a sense of dread. He didn't know what Levine was planning, but he knew it wouldn't be good. The meeting took place on a Thursday evening, September 15, 1842. The air was thick with humidity and the threat of rain. 15 men gathered at Levine's home, a modest but well-appointed house on the outskirts of the parish seat. The house was built in the American style rather than Creole, with a symmetrical facade and a central hallway. Levine greeted each guest personally as they arrived, shaking hands, making small talk, playing the role of gracious host. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit, his blonde hair neatly combed, his blue eyes clear and steady. He showed no sign of nervousness or concern. When all the guests had arrived, Levine led them to his parlor, a room furnished with comfortable chairs arranged in a semicircle. A sideboard held decanters of whiskey and brandy, glasses, cigars. Levine invited the men to help themselves, to make themselves comfortable. The atmosphere was surreal. It felt like a social gathering, not a confrontation. The men sat in uncomfortable silence, waiting to hear what the doctor had to say. Levine stood before them, calm and composed. He held a glass of brandy in one hand, and he took a small sip before beginning to speak. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "I understand there have been questions about certain births that have occurred over the past several years. Questions about the appearance of these children, about their parentage, about my possible involvement." The room was absolutely silent. Every eye was fixed on Levine. "I want to address these questions directly and honestly," Levine continued. "I believe that clarity is preferable to rumor, that truth is preferable to speculation. So let me be clear. Yes, I am the father of these children, all of them." The silence shattered into chaos. Men shouted, stood, demanded explanations. Judge Thibault called for order, his voice barely audible over the uproar. Broussard was on his feet, his face purple with rage. Duchamp looked as though he might faint. Levine waited, patient, sipping his brandy, until the room quieted again. It took several minutes. "I understand your shock," Levine said when he could be heard again. "But before you judge me, I ask that you hear my explanation. What I have done with purpose and with what I believe to be sound reasoning." "Sound reasoning?" Broussard shouted. "You've violated—" "I have conducted an experiment," Levine interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. "A scientific experiment that I believe has profound implications for our understanding of human heredity and racial characteristics." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. Confused. Horrified. Levine walked to a desk in the corner of the room and retrieved a leather-bound journal. He held it up so everyone could see. "For the past 7 years," he said, "I have been studying the question of racial inheritance. Specifically, I wanted to understand whether the physical characteristics we associate with race are immutable or whether they can be altered through selective breeding." He opened the journal, showing pages filled with notes, diagrams, measurements, observations. The handwriting was neat and precise, the work of someone who took pride in documentation. "I theorized," Levine continued, "that by introducing European genetic material into the African population, I could produce offspring that displayed European features. The children born over these years have confirmed my hypothesis. Regardless of the mother's appearance, my genetic contribution has dominated, producing children with blonde hair, blue eyes, and fair skin." Vincent Heber felt physically ill. Around him, other men showed similar reactions. Pale faces, clenched jaws, hands gripping chair arms. The casual way Levine spoke about human beings, about women, about children, was more disturbing than any rage or justification would have been. "You're talking about human beings," Thibault said, his voice shaking. "Not livestock, not experimental subjects. Human beings, am I?" Levine asked, turning to face the judge. His expression was genuinely curious, as though this were an interesting philosophical question. "The law of this state says otherwise, Judge Thibault. The law says these women are property. The law says their children are property. I have violated no statute, broken no law. I have simply used available resources to pursue scientific knowledge." "You've committed rape," Hebert said, the word hanging in the air like poison, "multiple times, against women who had no ability to refuse you, no ability to protect themselves." Levine turned to him, his expression unchanged. "Rape is a crime committed against persons, Mr. Hebert. These women are not legally persons. They are property. I no more committed rape than a farmer commits rape when he breeds his cattle. The law is quite clear on this point." The logic was monstrous, but it was also legally sound. Louisiana law in 1842 did not recognize enslaved people as having the legal standing to be victims of rape. They were property, and property could not be raped. The law protected property owners from theft or damage to their property, but it did not protect the property itself from the actions of others. Several of the plantation owners looked uncomfortable, but none spoke up to challenge Levine's reasoning, because to do so would be to challenge the entire legal and social structure that supported their way of life. If enslaved people were persons with rights, then the entire system of slavery became untenable. Why? Duchamp asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Why do this? What did you hope to gain? Knowledge. Levine replied simply. Understanding. I wanted to prove that racial characteristics are not fixed, that they can be manipulated through selective breeding. This has implications for everything. For slavery, for colonization, for the future of human civilization. He walked back to the center of the room, his journal still in his hand. Consider the possibilities, he said, his voice taking on an almost evangelical quality. If we can alter racial traits through selective breeding, we can reshape entire populations. We can create workers ideally suited to specific climates and tasks. We can eliminate undesirable characteristics and enhance desirable ones. We can engineer the future of humanity itself. You're insane, someone muttered. I'm a scientist, Levine corrected. And my experiment has been successful. The children exist. The evidence is undeniable. I have proven that European traits dominate African traits in mixed offspring. This is valuable knowledge, gentlemen. Knowledge that could be used to advance our understanding of human biology, of heredity, of the very nature of race itself. Judge Thibault stood, his face flushed with anger and something else. Disgust, perhaps, or horror at what he was hearing. Dr. Lavigne, he said, his voice hard. Regardless of the legal technicalities, what you've done is morally reprehensible. You've caused immense suffering to women who had no ability to refuse you. You've destroyed families. You've disrupted multiple plantations. You've created a scandal that will damage this entire region. I've created knowledge, Levine replied calmly. What you do with that knowledge is your concern, not mine. I've documented everything in this journal and in others. My methods, my observations, my conclusions. This information will be valuable to future scientists, to future generations. You will leave this parish, Thibault said. You will cease your practice here, sell your property, and go. If you refuse, I will find a way to bring charges. Legal technicalities be damned. I will make your life here impossible. Levine smiled slightly, and the smile was somehow more disturbing than anything else he'd said. I've already made arrangements to leave, Judge Thibault. My work here is complete. I've gathered sufficient data. I'm relocating to Texas, where I plan to continue my research on a larger scale. The frontier offers opportunities that are not available in more settled regions. Get out, Broussard said, his voice shaking with rage. Get out of this parish. Get out of Louisiana. And if I ever see you again, I'll kill you myself. Levine set down his brandy glass and inclined his head slightly, as though accepting a compliment. I'll be gone within the week, he said. Thank you for coming, gentlemen. I thought it important that you understand the truth of what has occurred. Rumors and speculation serve no one. The meeting dissolved into angry arguments, threats, and recriminations. But in the end, there was nothing anyone could do. Levine had broken no law. He could not be prosecuted, could not be punished through official channels. The system that should have protected the women he'd violated had instead protected him. Within 2 weeks, he was gone. His house was sold to a merchant from New Orleans. His practice was transferred to another doctor. His furniture, his books, his personal effects were packed and shipped. He vanished into the expanding American frontier, taking his journals, his data, and his monstrous certainty with him. The aftermath of Levine's revelation spread through the parishes like a fever. The plantation owners tried to suppress the story, but it was too late. Too many people knew. The scandal became common knowledge, discussed in New Orleans parlors, in riverboat saloons, in the careful letters that passed between planter families across Louisiana and beyond. The children remained, of course. 13 of them by the time Levine left, ranging in age from newborn to 5 years old. They grew up in the quarters, marked by their appearance, living proof of what had been done to their mothers. The mothers struggled with their children in different ways. Some, like Marie, tried to love these children despite everything. Marie held Claire close, sang to her, protected her as best she could. But there was always a distance, a wall that Marie couldn't quite break through. Every time she looked at Claire, she saw the violation, the helplessness, the night that had changed everything. Others couldn't bear to look at their children. Delphine at Riverside became withdrawn and silent after John's birth. She cared for him mechanically, feeding him, keeping him clean, but showing no affection. When Jean reached for her, she would turn away. When he cried, she would hand him to another woman to comfort. The children sensed this rejection, even as infants. They grew up knowing they were different, knowing they were unwanted, knowing their very existence caused pain. The fathers, the men who had been recorded as fathers, the men who had been partners to these women, reacted with anger and abandonment. Thomas never acknowledged Claire. He avoided Marie, avoided the cabin where she lived, avoided even looking at the child when their paths crossed. Eventually he requested a transfer to another plantation, and Duchamp granted it, glad to be rid of a source of tension. Samuel at Riverside did the same. So did Gabriel, Antoine, Louis, Joseph, Michel, Henri, Francois, and the others. These men had been paired with these women by their owners, forced into relationships they hadn't chosen. But they'd made lives together, found small comforts in companionship. The births destroyed those fragile connections. The women were left alone, raising children who looked nothing like them, children who were constant reminders of violation and powerlessness. The enslaved community was divided in its response. Some people felt sympathy for the mothers, understanding that something terrible had happened to them. They helped when they could, watching the strange-looking children, sharing food, offering what comfort was possible. Others were suspicious or hostile. They believed the mothers must have done something to bring this on themselves, must have been willing participants. They whispered about the women, spread rumors, shunned them. The children grew up in this atmosphere of suspicion and division. They were neither fully accepted nor fully rejected, existing in a liminal space within the quarters. As they got older, their appearance became even more striking. By the time Claire was 5 years old, she looked like a Swedish child who had somehow ended up on a Louisiana plantation. Her hair was long and blonde, her eyes that startling blue, her skin pale and prone to burning. She stood out among the other children like a candle in darkness. The same was true for all of Levine's children. They were beautiful in a conventional European sense, and this beauty made them valuable in a specific way. As they grew older, some were sold to traders who specialized in what were euphemistically called fancy girls, enslaved women with light skin who were sold for sexual exploitation. The boys were sometimes kept as house servants, their appearance making them suitable for positions where they would be seen by visitors. This was another layer of horror. Levine's experiment had not only violated the mothers, but had also created children who would be exploited because of their appearance, because of the very features that marked them as different. Vincent Hebert continued as overseer at Belmont for 3 more years after Levine's departure. But he found it increasingly difficult to continue in his position. Every day, he saw Claire growing up, saw Marie's pain, saw the evidence of a crime that had no legal name and no possibility of justice. In 1845, he resigned his position and moved to New Orleans. He found work as a clerk in a shipping office, a job that paid less but allowed him to sleep at night. He took his journals with him, the careful documentation of everything that had happened. Years later, in 1867, after the Civil War had ended and slavery had been abolished, Hebert donated his journals to a historical society. He wrote a cover letter explaining what the documents contained, why he'd kept them, what they represented. These records, he wrote, document a crime that was not legally a crime, a violation that was not legally a violation, suffering that was not legally suffering. They show how a system designed to treat human beings as property-created conditions, where the most monstrous acts could be committed without consequence. I kept these records because I believed that someday someone would want to know the truth, that someday the truth would matter. The journals were filed away in an archive, rarely examined, a testament to a crime that was never officially acknowledged. Judge Thibault tried to pursue legal action against Levine, but every attorney he consulted gave him the same answer. There was no case. No law had been broken. The women had no legal standing to bring charges. The plantation owners had no grounds for complaint, since their property had not been damaged in any legally recognized way. Thibault spent months researching, looking for any legal avenue that might allow prosecution. He consulted law books, wrote to colleagues in other states, sought advice from legal scholars. But the answer was always the same. Under Louisiana law in 1842, what Levine had done was not a crime. This realization haunted Thibault for the rest of his life. He'd spent his career believing in the law, believing that the legal system, however imperfect, served justice. Levine's case forced him to confront the truth, that the law itself could be unjust, that a legal system built on the premise that some human beings were property could never deliver justice to those people. Thibault retired from the bench in 1850, citing health reasons. He died in 1855, and those who knew him said he'd never been the same after the Levine affair. As for Dr. Marcus Levine, he did relocate to Texas, where he established a new medical practice in a growing frontier town. He continued his research for at least another decade, according to fragmentary records that survived. There are hints in letters, in birth records, in the memories of people who lived in that town, that the pattern continued. More children with impossible features, more women who couldn't speak of what had happened to them. Levine died in 1856, apparently of natural causes. He was 56 years old. His executor, a lawyer who had been handling his affairs, found his journals among his effects. The lawyer read them, was horrified by their contents, and made the decision to destroy them. He burned every journal, every note, every piece of documentation related to Levine's experiments. Some knowledge, the lawyer wrote in his own diary, is too dangerous to preserve. Some truths are too monstrous to pass on to future generations. I have destroyed Dr. Levine's work, not to protect his reputation, but to protect humanity from the ideas contained in those pages. But the children remained. The evidence of Levine's experiments lived on in the faces of 13 children in Louisiana and an unknown number in Texas. These children grew up, had children of their own, passed on the genes that Levine had introduced into their families. When the Civil War came and slavery ended, these children, now adults, faced a different kind of challenge. They were too white-looking to be easily accepted in black communities, too black by law and heritage to be accepted in white society. They existed in a liminal space, belonging nowhere, their very existence a reminder of the horrors that had created them. Some tried to pass as white, leaving their families and their histories behind, creating new identities in new places. This was possible for those with the lightest skin, the most European features. They disappeared into white society, married white spouses, raised children who never knew their true heritage. Others remained in black communities, accepting their outsider status, building lives despite the suspicion and questions that followed them. They married, had children, created families. Sometimes their children looked like them, blonde, blue-eyed, pale. Sometimes the African features reasserted themselves, producing children who looked more like their grandmothers than their parents. The genetic legacy of Levine's experiments continued for generations. Even today, more than 180 years later, there are families in Louisiana who occasionally produce a blonde-haired, blue-eyed child, despite having predominantly African ancestry. Most don't know the full story of their heritage. The details were buried, forgotten, or deliberately erased. But the story remains documented in those old ledgers, in Heber's careful notes, in the birth records that show an impossible pattern. A reminder that the horrors of slavery were not just about physical brutality or economic exploitation. They were also about the complete dehumanization of human beings, the reduction of people to property, to experimental subjects, to things that could be used and violated without consequence. Louisiana kept discovering those babies, kept recording their births, kept noting the impossible pattern. 13 children in 7 years, all with blonde hair and blue eyes, all born to enslaved women with dark features, all fathered by one man who saw them not as human beings, but as data points in an experiment. The system that should have protected their mothers, that should have punished their father, that should have recognized the crime for what it was, failed completely. Because in 1842, Louisiana enslaved women were not persons, they were property. And property could not be raped, could not be violated, could not demand justice. That was the real horror, not the births themselves, but the legal and social structure that made them possible and then protected the man responsible. The horror was in the system that allowed a respected doctor to conduct experiments on human beings without their consent, to violate women who had no legal recourse, to create children who would grow up marked by their origins, and to walk away without facing any consequences. The children were evidence. But evidence of what? Of a crime that had no name, no legal recognition, no possibility of prosecution. They were living proof that the system was working exactly as designed, to protect the powerful and deny humanity to the powerless. Vincent Heber understood this. In his final journal entry, written in 1867 before he donated his records to the Historical Society, he wrote, "I have spent 25 years trying to understand what happened in those Louisiana parishes between 1837 and 1844. I have documented the births, traced the pattern, identified the perpetrator, presented the evidence to those with the power to act. And I have learned that sometimes the greatest crimes are those that are perfectly legal, that sometimes the most profound injustice is built into the very structure of the law itself. Dr. Levine committed no crime under Louisiana law. He violated no statute. He broke no rule. He simply used the system as it was designed to be used, treating human beings as property, as resources, as experimental subjects. The law protected him because the law was written to protect men like him. The real crime was not what Dr. Levine did to those women, though that was monstrous enough. The real crime was the system that made it possible. The law that denied those women any legal standing, any rights, any recourse. The real crime was slavery itself. I kept these records because I believed that someday the truth would matter. That someday people would want to know what happened, would want to understand how such things were possible. I kept these records as a warning, as a reminder, as evidence of what happens when we deny the humanity of other human beings. The children born from Dr. Levine's experiments are now adults. They carry the mark of their origins in their faces, in their features, in the genes they will pass to their own children. They are living reminders of a crime that had no name, a violation that had no legal recognition, suffering that was not legally suffering. I hope that future generations will read these records and understand. I hope they will see the truth of what happened and resolve never to allow such things again. I hope they will build a society where all human beings are recognized as persons, where all people have rights, where the law protects the vulnerable rather than the powerful. That is my hope. But I am not optimistic, because I have seen how easily we deny the humanity of others, how quickly we justify the unjustifiable, how readily we accept systems that benefit us at the expense of others. These records are my testimony. This is what I witnessed. This is what happened. May God have mercy on us all. This story reveals one of the darkest aspects of American history, the complete legal vulnerability of enslaved people and the ways that power could be abused without consequence. The case of Dr. Marcus Lavinia and the 13 children born from his experiments shows how a system built on the premise that some human beings are property created conditions where the most monstrous acts could be committed without any legal repercussion. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you think there are other similar stories that have been buried or forgotten in American history? Leave your comment below and share your perspective. If you found this story as disturbing and important as I did, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates historical truth, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into America's hidden past. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.